If you'll permit me just a moment, Padre, una enorme valentía de estar aquí en el día de hoy, un riesgo muy alto en hablar tan claramente sobre estos temas en un evento público como este. I just thanked him for his courage and the great risk he takes at speaking here today. His family and those he cares about and loves are still vulnerable to a dictatorship that has shown the willingness to torture and jail and those who dare to speak against them. It's a truly diabolical regime in more ways than one. And we throw around political courage and terms like that loosely these days in politics. But this is true political courage, the willingness to risk your freedom, your life, your safety, that of those you love, to speak for a very fundamental truth. And that really is what I think is at the core of what we're discussing here. You know, it's interesting that I think that the right to live and be free is a basic elemental right. It's the one upon which our republic here was founded on. It was a revolutionary idea, this notion that somehow we are endowed by our Creator, that God has given us rights, and as chief among those rights is to life, to liberty, and to pursue happiness. We read those words today and kind of take it for granted. We look at it and say, well, of course. I mean, I don't even think there's a full appreciation of that sometimes when we use those words and we cite those words. But we don't fully appreciate what 200 some odd years ago, this was like a foreign concept. Like no society had ever organized itself around these notions. Some people had written about it, Locke and others had talked about it, but no one actually tried to live it. In fact, if you look at the history of mankind, about 5,500 years of recorded human history, with the exception of a brief period of time in Greece, no society was free or democratic. Virtually every human being that ever lived, up until about 200 years ago, had no choice in who their leaders were. Their leader was the person who won the last war. Their leader was the person who had the power to conquer your village, to force you into slavery and servitude. That was your leaders. You didn't get to vote for them. You didn't get to complain about them. I mean, you could, I suppose, but you wouldn't live long. And that was the condition of man. It was. It's been the condition of man for 5,500 years, up until about 200 years ago, with the founding of this country on that very powerful principle. And ironically, people like to point to our history and say, well, we never really fully lived up. We continue to not fully live up to the promise of our founding. But what I am most proud about this country is that each generation has brought us closer to fulfilling it. And we have come closer than any people at any other time in the history of the world. But we are constantly reminded, in Nicaragua, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Russia, in North Korea, in Iran, in much of the Middle East, to be frank, and in many other parts of the world, including on the continent of Africa, that while freedom and liberty is a natural right, it is not natural. That one of the most basic instincts of those who acquire power anywhere in the world has been oppression, has been to force people to agree with you, has been forced people to fall in line with what it is you tell them they need to do. And so it is this endeavor that the United States has been an example of, but other nations now have been a key part of, and it's one of the great stories, not just of the aftermath of the Second World War, but through the period of the Cold War, in which democracy spread, and at the end of the Cold War, how it spread around the world. But it's important to always remember that elections and democracy are not entirely the same thing. Elections and democracy and freedom are not always the same thing. You can have elections and not be a free society, especially if the media is controlled by one party. Candidates are oppressed, if no one can run against you. Look at Venezuela. They're going to have an election in a few weeks, but virtually everyone well, maybe this new guy is going to, it's certainly going to scare them, but they'll cheat and steal the election. They happen to control the people who count the votes. Has that no access to the media? Every one of the leading contenders has been put in jail or barred from the ballot. They're having an election, but that's not a democracy, and it most certainly is not freedom. I would argue that the elections it's a fact, the elections in Russia aren't necessarily free. People say, oh, Putin's very popular in Russia. I'd be very popular in America if I controlled all the media. So, you think about that, and the reason why I point that out is look at the problems in the world today. Look at where we look in the world today and say, okay, there's a problem. What is behind all these problems? If you go to the Middle East, it's Iran and radical jihadists. If you go to Europe, it's Putin and Russia. If you go to the Indo-Pacific, it's China and then North Korea. What do they all, if you go in the Western Hemisphere, look at the source of mass migration in some of these countries. It's Venezuela, it's Nicaragua, it's Cuba, it's Bolivia. and it's places that are overrun by drug cartels and narco-traffickers and narco-terrorists. What do all these have in common? What do narco-terrorists and Kim Jong-un and Fidel Castro and Maduro and the Ortega lunatics and Putin and Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, what do they, and the regime in Tehran and the radical jihadists and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all the other, what do they all have in common? These are not Democrats. These are not people that believe in liberty. These are not people that believe in the dignity of the human being, in the dignity of the individual, of the right not just to be free, but to have the freedom and the liberty to fully live up to your potential, to what you were created to be by God, and to serve the common good, to have the liberty to do what is right. It's one of the great misconceptions about freedom. Freedom is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It is the freedom to be who you were created to be and do what was right, and do what is right, to have the liberty to do what is right. And so all the problems of the world find their genesis at their core in totalitarian, oppressive movements and or regimes. And as much as we wanted to believe that history had ended in 1991 with the end of the Cold War, human nature has not changed. Human nature is the same today as it was 5,500 years ago, and it tends towards tyranny and towards oppression. And we are seeing it reemerge now. The challenges to freedom and democracy all over the world are embedded in this new coalition of governments, of China and Russia and North Korea and Iran, who are in a formal alliance like NATO but are increasingly cooperating. And they'll argue they want to have an alternative to the Western-dominated world, and they argue that they want to have an alternative to the U.S. international order. But at their core, what they are arguing is that totalitarianism doesn't promise freedom, but it promises order. It promises stability. They point to our society and say, look at them, they're fighting against each other, their college kids take over their campus and riot. You got one presidential candidate standing trial, and the other guy, you know, they're running against them. They want to put his son in jail. They hate each other. They can't even pass budget bills. Democracy is messy. It doesn't work. Freedom doesn't work. Here's what works. What works is the order that we can provide, but you got to give up your freedom. That's always the promise of totalitarians. The promise they always offer is we will provide order and stability, but the price is your freedom. And that movement is resurgent in the world. And frankly, for a world emerging from COVID-19 and all the disruptions of globalization, to some people it's increasingly appealing. In some nations that are basically desperately looking for order, for people basically looking for stability and understanding and some sense of as I said, of stability for themselves and for their country, the totalitarian offers something that might be appealing in the short term, but it never works out. There is not a single example of long-term totalitarianism that has worked out. In fact, totalitarianism always leads to the same thing: poverty and exile, in which your best, in which your brightest, in which your biggest dreamers, the people with the biggest hopes, the ones with the most to contribute, are forced to leave the country of their birth. In the case of Nicaragua and the bishop we honor tonight, these aren't just people like, you know, we talk about standing up for freedom, but in America, you know, you stand up for freedom, you stand up against somebody condemning you, you know, obviously every case is different, but generally what ends up happening is people say really nasty things about you in social media. Maybe some friends will no longer talk to you because you didn't vote the way they wanted you in the last election, and life goes on. In many parts of this world, the price for speaking up is your life. It's your freedom. It's suffering. It's exile. And it's the people you love being targeted as well. And so it takes real, extraordinary, not just political courage, but courage to speak so clearly and so valiantly and to continue to do so in the face of this oppression. Nicaragua is particularly lamentable because it doesn't get much attention. It doesn't have oil. It doesn't have an economy that sort of weighs on the world. So it's largely ignored. Not by us, not by those of us who work on the issue, but it's largely ignored. But even in what it's involved in now, it's a source of great instability. If the Ortega regime had its way, the Russians would have a base in Nicaragua, the Chinese would too. And by the way, if you pay them $1,000, you can fly there from anywhere on this planet. And within a few weeks, if not days, be able to transit into the United States illegally as a migrant. They have opened their doors and welcomed people in as a portal into our country, a great source of instability. In the case of Cuba, 70 years now of suffering by an enslaved island. Just in the last 5 years, 3% of its population has left. The case of Venezuela, 8 million people have left that country in a decade. In place after place, these are the consequences of tyranny. And so the importance of groups like this and voices like that of the gentleman we honor tonight and of the father who's here with us tonight who also was so brave to speak, it's critical that we continue to line up behind them, that we continue to speak on their behalf. Freedom is not some quaint, old idea whose time has come and gone. It is as important today as it's ever been, and the threats to it are as elevated as they have been since 1991 or 89. It's amazing to believe that just 3 decades ago, I graduated high school, the Berlin Wall came down, the world looked like, okay, that's it, it's over. Never again will there be Marxism, never again will there be tyranny, the whole world will now be free, they got a taste of freedom and they're never going to go back. But we forgot that human nature doesn't change. And so not only we, but our children, our grandchildren, and every generation that will follow us will also have to confront totalitarianism. Because sadly, it is embedded in the DNA of humanity. It is embedded in the DNA of those who take power. And only a commitment to freedom and democracy and liberty and systems that protect it can guarantee that it doesn't return as a scourge on the earth. It's also incumbent upon us who live and function and work in democratic societies to prove that, yes, republics and democracies are messy. Yes, our debates are vibrant and heated. It's not nearly as neat as totalitarianism, but we solve real problems and ultimately we make real progress. The United States has progressed, and we should never shy away from telling that story. We should never shy away from telling the story that all of the great movements in American history, every single one of them, women's suffrage, the end of slavery, the end of segregation, every single one of them was an appeal to our founding principles, not a rejection of them. These were not people saying, overthrow the Constitution, ignore the Declaration of Independence, walk away from all the things we were founded on, and let's embrace something new and different. Every one of them demanded that we live up to the principles of our founding. That's how powerful that idea is. And that example is critical. Nations around the world and peoples need to see that freedom and democracy are not just something to aspire to as an ideal, but as a practical matter, it works, and it works better than totalitarianism. It takes longer, it's harder. It requires you to listen to people you don't agree with. It requires you to work with people you think maybe I'm half crazy. Right, Dan? A little bit? Half crazy? Quarter crazy? But that's the alternative is that a small group of people get to decide what happens, and we have no voice or role in it. So sometimes people say to me, well, you've never lived under totalitarianism. They're wrong. Growing up, my home was a totalitarian regime. My home was totalitarian, and my home now is totalitarian too, by the way. Even though 3 of my 4 kids are now voters, so I have to be careful. But they're not taxpayers. Well, one of them is a taxpayer, but still totalitarian. My home. But I'll close with this. I have been blessed with this. I have grown up my entire life, virtually my entire life, surrounded by people who lost the nation of their birth. Obviously, Cuban exiles, but not just Cuban, Nicaraguan, now Venezuelan, even Colombians who had to leave their home because their country was being overrun by dangerous narco-terrorists that at one point threatened the very stability and existence of the country and its government. And sadly now, the wave of Venezuelans that have experienced the same. And it's interesting when you talk to people, whether it's the Cubans that lived there in the 1950s or the Nicaraguans that lived there in the late 1970s or those who have had to flee Venezuela more recently, every single one of them says in some form or fashion the same thing. I never could have imagined that this could have happened. I never imagined it could happen. No Venezuelan 15 years ago believed that it was possible that their country would turn into a narco-Marxist state. No Cuban in 1956, they may not have been a fan of Batista in 1957, 1958, but they never thought Cuba would become some Marxist puppet of the Soviet Union. No one living in Nicaragua in the late 1970s thought it was possible that some group of Sandinistas would take power and turn it into a satellite of Cuba. But it happened. It happened because totalitarianism is relentless. And its desire to dominate never ends, and the voices that speak out against it must constantly continue to speak out against it in every form or fashion, or it will continue to spread, sometimes hiding behind some interpretation of Islam, sometimes hiding behind an individual like Kim Jong-un who has to figure out how to remain a dictator for the next 40 years, sometimes behind the ideology of the Communist Party of China, sometimes behind the personal singular ambitions of one individual, Vladimir Putin, who wants to be a czar. But it continues to spread and it never stops. It is insatiable. It can never be negotiated with. It can never be accommodated. It will never settle for true peace or coexistence. October 7th reminds us of that. These people are never going to be satisfied. Any group of people that's willing to maim and murder innocents, kidnap and rape, take back people into these tunnels, totalitarianism is insatiable. And so must the freedom fighter be. And those voices come from everywhere. Father, we're honored, deeply honored that you would speak here tonight, given, as I said, the real courage that it takes to do so. And my last phrase is, I think the church always has had a special role to play. It most certainly did in Poland. Because one of the things that I think we risk, those of us who believe in freedom and democracy and are involved in government, is we end up worshiping government. Government is a tool. Government and politics is a tool. Ultimately, that government and power is not the goal. The goal is the common good. To promote the common good based on the belief that every human being has basic dignity and certain inalienable rights that come from their Creator. And the church is deeply rooted in that belief. And it has played an invaluable role, certainly in Poland. And the Solidarity movement probably would not have survived without the support of Pope John Paul II and the influence of the church in Poland. And it's great and important to see that the church has played such a valiant role in the struggles going on inside of Nicaragua. And there's a reason why when Fidel takes over, he runs out the Catholic Church, starting with the Jesuits. He had been trained by Jesuits, so he knew, I got to get rid of these guys because the next kid growing up that's going to overthrow me is probably being trained in their school right now, so he got rid of them. My son actually goes to that high school now in Miami. And my other son graduated from there. They had one bad alumni, unfortunately. His name was Fidel Castro, because Raul never graduated. So they always remind you of that. There's a reason why he ran the church out and declared an atheist state. And there's a reason why Ortega and Murillo have declared war on the church. Above all else, totalitarian wants you to worship the state. They want you to worship the party. They want you to worship the ideology. They cannot allow either family or God to come before the state. They cannot allow there to be any higher moral authority. They must be the absolute and final word on everything, and they cannot be challenged, particularly by a belief in God and our rights that are inherent in our creation. And so that's why the church has an important role to play, because the concept of freedom and liberty is not a political concept. It is a spiritual one. Christ came to free us from sin, and the church is here on earth as his representative, not just to help provide us the tools to follow Christ, but also to free us from tyranny and from the denial of our basic rights that are given to us by our Creator to every single human being. So thank you for your courage. It's my honor to share the stage with you tonight, and thank you all for everything you do. And thank Dan Sullivan, who's a great activist, not just on behalf of this organization, particularly the work he does in the Indo-Pacific, where, as you know, religious liberty and freedom is challenged every single day. And so thank you for your service in that regard, and God bless all of you. Thank you for the chance to speak to you.